Hi, my name's Jesse and I make music under the name Abayomi, and today I'd like to show you how I make a melodic techno track using Ableton Live and some external hardware. So let's get into it.
So just before we get started, I'd just like to show you the track template that I like to use before I get started with any track. So on my master, I have a utility device which I use for mixing to adjust the general gain, because I tend to like to mix and produce fairly quietly so I can adjust the gain when I need to. And also using the mono function because I really like to mix a track when it's I've got all the elements ready in mono so that I can really adjust the leveling correctly. Then I have 3 return tracks. In the first track, I have a Valhalla vintage verb. In the second track, I have a Valhalla delay. And in the third return track, I have an echo device with a different delay time from the Valhalla delay. Each of my tracks also by default has an EQ and compressor. I just find that really helpful because it's usually the go-to thing that I'm going to use, particularly the EQ, maybe not so much the compressor, but it's just nice to know that it's one step less. So let's get started. The first thing I'll need to do is just adjust my tempo. So currently it's 120. I'm going to work at 126 for this particular project. And what I'm going to do is to go in my browser, and from the desktop, I've got a sample that I've recorded from an analog synth. And what I usually like to do is also record my samples sometimes in another session, or just basically noodling around trying to figure out how to get new sounds out of a particular hardware device. So let's preview that. I'm just going to drag and drop that into an audio track and just adjust the volume and playback. Now, what's interesting about this particular sample is that it's actually mono, it's not stereo. And I want to give it a little bit of stereo width. And to do that, I'm just going to use a simple chorus plugin. And this one in particular is called Flare. And I'm just going to drag that out and drag and drop that into my audio track. And let's hear that back again. And I'm just going to adjust some of the parameters, adjusting the width a little bit and the number of voices. When I use the flare, I try not to use it in extreme settings because I just want to increase the stereo presence of this sample slightly and not too much. So the next thing I want to do to this sample is to give it a little bit of an imperfection. And to do this, I'm going to use a plugin called RC20. And what RC20 basically does is it adds something called wow and flutter, which modulates the pitch of the sample. And you can also add things like digital distortion, or in this case, I'm going to add some tape noise to this particular sample. So just to demonstrate, I'm going to adjust the wobble parameter so you can hear how the RC20 modulates the pitch of the sample. And then I'm just going to dial it back to a more reasonable setting. And in addition to this, I'm going to add some noise, and I can choose the different types. So I'm going to choose some tape noise. And again, at extreme setting, you can hear it. And yeah, just dial it back so it's just barely audible. And finally, I'll adjust the last parameter, magnetic. As a last step for this sample, I will make an adjustment to the sends on this particular audio track. The first being the reverb. By adjusting the reverb send, you can already hear how it opens up the sample and gives the sample some space. And the second send I'll use is the delay send. And I'll open this up all the way and then dial it back to a comfortable position where I'm happy with how it sounds.
The melodic loop makes a really great starting point. The next thing I'll need to do is to create some drums. And to do this, I'm going to use my external drum synth, the Vermona DRM.
I have a template in my collections folder called Vermona DRM, and I'm going to load that into the current project. So I really like to work with templates and my own presets because it really speeds up my workflow. And in this particular MIDI track, you can see I have an external instrument device which is already routed to my audio interface. And I have an audio effects rack with 3 simple devices, a utility, an EQ8 that's already pre-configured, and a Max for Live device called the color limiter, which works like a regular limiter but has a few extra parameters that I like to use. In addition to the devices, I also have a pre-programmed MIDI clip in the MIDI track. As soon as I hit play on the MIDI clip, I can hear my drum synthesizer. As you can hear, the kick drum pitch is quite high. The main reason why I like to use an analog drum synthesizer is that I can tune most of the parameters to my liking to fit the particular song. So I'm going to do that right now. So with the kick drum tuned to my liking, I'm now ready to record an audio clip of that kick drum. And I'm going to use audio track number 4. I'm going to hit Command R to use the shortcut to rename that particular track. And then in the routing section, I'm going to select the Vermona DRM track. I'm going to arm the track, and then I'm going to record a clip of a minimum of 16 bars. The reason why I like to do this is because it gives me enough material to work within the arrangement view and just helps my arrangement process to be that little bit faster.
So as a next step, I'm going to continue recording rhythmic elements from the Vermona DRM.
So in the same way that I recorded the kick drum, I also recorded some more drum parts from the Vermona DRM. So I'm just going to run through them quickly. Of course, we had the kick drum. I recorded some hi-hats. Recorded some snares. And also some claps to layer with the snares. Recorded some toms. And I recorded some more snares to use as ghost notes. So once I recorded all the drum parts as audio clips, I organized them together in a group, which also contained some groups and groups. And I organized the clips just to have a basic flow and build up of all the drum parts. In addition to that, I also did some very basic EQ and compression on some of the sounds, not all of them, but just to make sure that they fit together nicely.
Now that I've recorded all my drum parts, I'm going to do some basic processing using EQ and compression.
I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of low cutting, so with these two additional sounds, I'm going to actually do the same. Just set a nice standard curve. Just get rid of some of that low frequencies. And the same thing would be for the hi-hats. Just bring them down a touch. Less to clear up. Another thing that I also really like to do is make use of the panning controls in the simpler device itself. So if I hit the control panel, I love the random panning feature. Just adding a touch of it just helps, you know, those lighter percussion elements dance around your ears in the panorama. And I'll do the same thing with the rim shots. Just give them a bit more movement. And with these hi-hats, I'm going to do something slightly different. Quite simple though, just use an auto pan. Just get a nice bit of movement going on there. Just solo that for a second. And then finally, on the actual drum group itself, in my EQ compression collections folder, I will pull out the Drum Shaper plugin. And what this plugin basically does, it works with transients. So I can sort of really make the beginning, the attack part of the sound very sharp. See, so sharp it's actually putting my master in the red. And also adjust the sustain quite drastically, but I'm just actually going to make it just a little bit tighter, to give it a little bit more space for other things that will come along later.
So the next thing I'd like to do is to record some bass lines. And to do this, I'm essentially going to use the same notes, but record the bass lines from two different sources.
So in this particular case, I'm going to choose a VST first, and I'm going to select the Uher Diva, which is like an analog modeling synth, but there's a patch that I particularly like that I want to use. So I'm just going to select that on the MIDI track. Okay, I've got signal, and I'm just going to record the bass line real quick. So I've recorded that bass line. Just going to go in and just fold the piano bar and just make sure that everything is in legato. And I'm just going to quickly quantize it, make sure everything's nice and tight. I'll add a little bit of groove to it, but in this case, it's not going to make too much of a difference because it's quite a long bass. So the next thing I want to do is record the same bass line, but using the Moog Sub 37. I want to use exactly the same notes, so I want to copy this MIDI clip in the Diva track. And to do that, I'll hold the Alt button and click and drag that across to the next MIDI track, which I've already set up with my external instrument. So for this recording, I'm just going to solo that particular track and then hit play on the clip. As you can hear, it's not really in the bass region, so I want to select all the notes in the clip detail view. And using the shift key and the down cursor on my computer keyboard, I'm just going to shift all the notes down 1 octave. So that's fine. Now I'm ready to record. I've already set up a audio track adjacent to the MIDI track, so I'm just going to arm that. And I'm just going to record in the same way as I did with the drums, a couple of different clips and modulate the parameters on the Moog so I have some nice variation when I come to the arrangement. So once I recorded a couple of different versions of the Moog bass line as clips, I then did some very basic sound processing. First of all, just using an EQ and a compressor. So the EQ is just rolling off some of the low frequencies and reducing the low mids. And then I also used the amp device, which is a great device for adding saturation and distortion. Usually you'd expect to use this for guitars, but it works really well on synths. So here's the sound without the amp. And then switching it on, you can immediately hear there's a lot more presence and aggression in the sound. Maybe a little bit too much, so I'm going to dial that back using the dry wet control. And what I will do is use this particular bass line to layer underneath the Diva bass line, and probably at lower volume, just to accentuate the bass and add a little bit more movement to the bass using the layering technique.
So now that my song is starting to take shape, I'd like to create a musical break. And to do this, I'm going to use some simple sound design techniques.
I basically copied over the audio clip into a new audio track, EQ'd it. So I just made sure that it has sort of more of a mid-range kind of sound to it. But then I also added this other plugin called the Decimort, which actually is, contrary to the paradox of its name, a high-quality bit crusher. This is what the kick sounded on its own. This adds sort of some noise and texture to it. And I just added some pretty quick compression at the end, but not too much. And that was the kick drum for the break. Then I also copied over the melody. And in this case, I used something quite interesting, which is called the unlinking of envelopes. So if I go into my envelope section, I actually have the dry wet of the mix of the reverb that I'm using in this particular track. And that reverb is here, the diffuse, and you can actually see how the dry wet sort of increasing as we go through the length of the track. And this loop is unlinked to the actual length of the audio clip, and it's set to 16 bars. So you get this nice sort of slowly creeping in, washed out reverb sound over the whole 16 bar period.
So to create a variation of the melody, rather than writing a new melody, I decided to apply a very simple technique using pitch and Live's warping algorithm.
So all I did was, in this particular case, was pitch up the original sample by 12 semitones, so exactly 1 octave, using the transpose function of the audio clip. And so that sounded then like this. If I just deactivate all of the extra effects that I used. In this particular case, I switched from the regular warping algorithm, which is beats, to complex. So because it better suited this particular audio clip. Then I added an auto pan, but instead of having the phase set at 180 so that it's moving between the left and right speakers, I set the phase to 0 so it acts a little bit more like a tremolo. So it basically adjusts the volume. Added some erosion, which is one of my favorite audio effect devices. And then mapped an Max for Live LFO to the frequency and amount of that erosion device. And then in addition to that, I decided why not reintroduce the bass line in a different way. So I added an arpeggiator to my Moog Sub 37 and decided to do a round of recording, adjusting the parameters. So to do that, all I did was create an audio track, set the track to record.
So after recording the melody variation and the arpeggiated notes from the Moog Sub 37, I decided to record a B-part melody, but this time using Live's wavetable.
I used a stock wavetable preset from Live's library, and it basically sounds like this. And this was my alternative melody, just very simple sort of wispy pads. And then what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to have this pad as an upper octave and a lower octave. So what I did was I grouped the particular wavetable, and then here simply duplicated it. And then to the second one, I added a MIDI effect called pitch, and I just dragged that in front of the wavetable and pitched that down by 12 semitones. Now I'll have both playing. And what I usually like to do, particularly with devices that are CPU intensive, is that I will simply freeze that particular track.
Once I have all my musical ideas together in the form of clips, the next thing that I need to perform is some project housekeeping.
What I'll do is I'll spend quite a bit of time rearranging the clips, color coding them, making sure that I've put everything more or less into groups so that I know where everything is. And I will spend also some time mixing. So this is where the utility really comes in handy, switching it to mono and mixing in mono. In other words, just leveling things according to that mono sound that I've created with the utility device. Then I might also spend some time going into using different plugins to enhance sounds or to further improve my sound design for that particular track. And then once I've done most of these things and I've arranged everything into scenes, it's only then that I'll start to move these ideas over into the arrangement view. The reason why I do all this stuff first is because it really helps me to focus on laying down the song idea in the arrangement view as quickly as possible, and that I'm not dwelling too much on re-recording material or adding extra material in. And it's usually at that point in the arrangement view where I'll only put things in if I really feel something is missing. In fact, I'll most likely do the opposite, which is actually take things away. Sometimes I just create too much material and then I end up actually not using it. But I'd rather have more to start with than less, and then find myself going back and forth in the session and arrangement view to create more material.
So now that I've organized all my clips and tracks in the session view, it's time to get into arrangement. And to do this, it usually takes a while, so I'm going to show you what I came up with.
So this is roughly what initial arrangement will look like for me once I've finished sorting everything out in the session view, and I've either placed the clips in just simply by dragging and dropping them, or I've recorded each scene into its place in the arrangement. And as mentioned before, I just have everything organized in groups because it makes it a lot easier for me to navigate the sections. Also, if it comes to mixing, then I can really solo and focus on one particular section if I want to, say for example, just continue working on mixing the drums. And another thing that really becomes really valuable is working in these sort of 16 bars of material. So let's say for example here where I have sort of toms, and I know exactly that, okay, if I duplicate that, I've covered another section. And that helps also when I'm using the locators, which I absolutely find essential when working in the arrangement view. It really makes it easy for me to navigate between the different sections if it's to play them, or if I want to just have an overview of all the particular elements that are happening in that particular section. Yeah, it takes a while for me to be happy with an arrangement. Usually what I'll do is like now just maybe render a preliminary draft and just have a listen to it and see what I think about it. Take a few days to, work on it again and adjust particular parameters. But all in all, this is really how I like to make sure that the majority of the work is done in the session view and that I can have like a quick arrangement and adjustment.
So I hope you enjoyed this video and got some insight into how I like to work with a hybrid setup and make the best of both worlds. Thanks for watching, and see you again.